What's Your Work Fit is sponsored by Hudson Davis. Start your brand's marketing and communications journey today at hudsondaviscommunications.com. I'm Dan Smolin. I built a successful executive career in marketing and communications before becoming a top headhunter and founding my own executive search firm. Now get this, every day, mainstream media runs stories in which old school bosses and thought leaders frame your work and workplace issues in ways that are often divisive and unmeaningful. And that's just crazy. The time has come for you to answer the question, what's your work fit? So that your work and career fit who you are, how you want to live, and what you want your lasting contributions to be. What's your work fit? It answers your questions and tackles the issues that keep you up at night about advancing your career in this time of workplace revolution. So let's get started. Hey, good day, everyone. Dan Smolin here on What's Your Work Fit. Today is a continuation of our What's Your Work Fit in the Workplace series. I am very, very excited about today's show, and we have a lot of viewers around the world tuning in live. Thank you so much for your support and viewership. I want to get right to it and introduce our guest today. He is Stanford University Professor of Economics, Nick Bloom. How are you, Nick?
Very good. It's the Californian morning. Halloween was last night, so I didn't go to bed too late. Going out trick-or-treating with my youngest. So yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me on, Dan.
It's an absolute pleasure, sir. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I think most people on LinkedIn who are following Future of Work and Workplace know of Professor Nick Bloom. He is the leading research source of remote work and workplace insights. He's been doing it a long time, well over 20 years. Joining us today are my co-hosts, Mark Gilbreath from Liquid Space. Good day, Mark.
Morning, Dan. Hey, Nick.
And also Fran Saele, who is prolific on LinkedIn, writing about commercial real estate, future of work and workplace, and lots of other key insights. Good morning, Fran.
Good morning, Dan. Great to be here.
All right, Nick. So we're going to get right to it. Normally on What's Your Work Fit, we get a viewer submitted question, and it's usually some fever dream that's keeping them up night about the work that they do and hope to do. Today's question came from Fran, Mark, and myself, and it is foundational to where we go forward in our discussions of future and work and the workplace. And it is this. Wait a minute. Why am I not? Here we go. It is this. What are the new economics of the workplace? So get us started, Nick, in understanding the economic structures that are impacting where work and workplace have gone and where they're going.
Great, Dan. So what I give you just the 30,000 foot overview. So my take on this, having studied economics for 25 years, is the work from home explosion that we saw after the pandemic is the biggest change to US, European, global labor markets, probably since World War II. So World War II was pretty massive. Men went off to fight. Women ended up working in factories, government shops, that discovered, society discovered they were doing a fantastic job. And that led to an enormous increase in female labor supply and kind of roughly doubled the workforce. We're seeing something of a similar importance with the explosion of work from home. So why does that matter? There are three groups I think are really impacted. First is firms. So for firms, this is profitable. I'll come back to it later, but that's what's stuck. In a capitalist economy, things that makes companies money sticks, and hybrid and fully remote is profitable for most firms to do. Second, employees love it. So employees tell us in surveys they value the ability to work from home 2-3 days a week, about the same as an 8% pay increase. So, any of us that are able to work from home hybrid or fully remote, depends what you want, have had enormous additional perk. And then thirdly, it's a huge benefit for society. So less commuting, less pollution. A lot of data shows more parents are getting to spend time with their kids. Even bigger picture, work from home looks like it's driving growth. So we could see growth rates pick up by maybe 0.5% a year for the next few years because of increases in labor supply. And that's a big deal. If you look at, this week, the Fed is deciding on interest rates. These things are really driven by the ability to pick up growth. So if you're worried about inflation or high interest rates, work from home is kind of like your savior. If it's increasing labor supply, it's pushing those things down. So I'll stop there. But as an economist, it's a massive change. And I see everyone around is so impacted and so interested in it.
Mark, take it from here.
Nick, the good editors at the New York Times and the Economist and the Wall Street Journal and even the algorithms at LinkedIn that have a lot of influence and control over the headlines that we all see on a daily basis, it would seem that they want to have us believe that there's a massive conflict or a struggle in place with headlines like Amazon and Zoom regressing back to work at the office alone. To what extent do you see that as being true on the street? And for those leaders that are following that dog whistle, if you will, what are they misunderstanding with regards to work from home, hybrid work, and its productivity impacts or lack thereof?
It's a great question. So yesterday, as we were discussing in the pre-warm-up, I put out a LinkedIn post. I think it was, a Halloween treat for people that like work from home, which is 3 different data sources all show the same thing. One is Sway, the second is the census, the third is the Castle data on, 2 on work from home levels, the third is office occupancy. What you see is in 2020, 2021, work from home levels were falling, people returning to the office. 2022, it starts to slow down. 23, it's totally flat. Throughout the whole of this year, it's totally flat. At some point, it's going to start heading back up again as technology and cohort effects push us up. So that's very clearly there in the data, and I don't think anyone that looks at the big data is surprised. Then the question is, why do the media headlines appear to say otherwise? There's kind of 2 things going on. One is, I talk to a lot of journalists. I mean, probably many of my friends and colleagues, a lot of actually former economists that are PhD econ that are in journalism. And what you hear over and over again is journalists tend to be rewarded when they write pieces for clicks and for comments. So if you write a piece that's kind of factual but a bit boring, like Zoom asks people back to the office for 2 days a week if you live within 50 miles and lets you be fully remote if you live 50 miles or more away, it's not very exciting. If instead you say Zoom cancels work from home, it's all over. People furiously click and comment and fire it around the internet and the thing takes off. And so I hate to say it, but there's a huge incentive for over-exaggeration. That's one driver of why, the facts don't seem as apparent. The other is there's a bit of a disconnect between what I call the very kind of tippity top CEOs and what's going on in the ground. So think of the kind of David Solomon, Jamie Dimon, Elon Musk's. These are people who, to give them full credit, have been phenomenally successful. These are the superstars of their industries. They have had amazing careers. The issue is they're very work focused. Those guys probably work 100 hours a week. They have tens, hundreds, billions of dollars invested in their companies. They're the CEOs. When they go into the office, everyone laughs at their jokes. So they tend to be very, very office focused. They have a limo or a helicopter, a jet that takes them there and back. So not surprisingly, these guys want to spend every hour that they can in the office. But the rest of us, the other 99.9999% of us, don't live in that world. And so, of course, you interview, a $2 billion net worth CEO. They want to be in the office 100-hour a week. You interview a senior manager. And to be honest, I talk to, as do you guys, thousands of these people. They typically want to work from home maybe 2-3 days a week and go in the office. They have home lives and families and sports and activities, etc. And so that's the other disconnect that the media keeps interviewing, the same Elon Musk's, Jamie Dimons, and doesn't seem to be so focused because they say outrageous things. That's kind of why. Look, if I was a journalist, they say something extreme, you write it up, people click furiously on your story and your hit rates goes up.
Fran?
Yeah. Nick, yesterday, co-star Phil Mobley, I don't know if you know Phil or not. He does a lot of analytics for them, but he made a couple of statements that I thought were really interesting. He said his economic forecast shows that office user growth is only going to increase at 0.4% per year for the next 8 years, which seemed to be pretty low. And then he said, which I think a more interesting stat, that for 2023 to date, real estate transactions have increased by 7%, but the amount of space leased is down 22%. In light of that, and assuming this trend continues, outside of the supercharged Hudson Yards buildings in New York City, which are really quite good, and forgive me for not killing my phone. So sorry. This happens, everybody. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that. I said, the question is, do you think that we're going to see negative absorption in office space through the decade? In other words, more space being vacated than leased to tenants in aggregate?
Yeah, so probably yes. There's a quote that I think is attributed to 𝘞𝘩𝘢. I'm not sure who, but we hit peak office space. We probably hit peak office space in the US in maybe 2020, 21, 22. The reason it isn't 2020 is projects start and they take a couple of years to end. So it's like turning an oil tanker. But right now, I've amazed if anyone is breaking ground on new office developments, or very little. So a few, but these things have kind of, so as an economist, we know that in markets where there's way too much supply and not enough demand, prices drop and eventually the market clears at a lower price. And the office market is, it's like any market. So I saw some predictions from JLL. I was actually up in San Francisco yesterday for a big event on, the doom loop. The thought there is, and I think it's generally true for the office market, it's going to be pretty bad for the next few years. At some point it will clear. It's not going to clear because people return to the office. It will, because demand is rising. It's going to clear because office construction slows down. Some stuff gets converted, some gets scrapped. And in the long run, the supply of office space will slowly shrink down to meet demand. So right now it's kind of being saved a bit, because even though footfall's down 50%, use is only down about 20%. Why is use not down more? The reason is most of that footfall is happening Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. It's kind of hard to cut space if people are only in the office typically 3 days a week. But eventually, firms are going to get a bit smarter about scheduling use. More people are going to shift slowly to remote. So the office market is not a meltdown, but certainly I wouldn't be building new offices. And I think the total square footage supplied is going to be it's either going to be flat, which, it's not good news in an economy that's growing. The US is growing, population is growing, GDP is growing. So office would normally grow with that. If it's flat, that's, a shrinking share of GDP. If anything, it's not even flat, it's actually declining. So the office market is maybe like manufacturing in the 1990s. Manufacturing's had a long decline for 30 years, 20 years, and it's now kind of reviving a bit. The office market might be like US manufacturing for the next 10 years, kind of not dead, doing fine. There'll be some people making money, but it's going to be a pretty tough environment.
So, Nick, one of our viewers, Bruce, wrote in a comment that I think speaks to, the comment that the Jamie Dimons made about, there's all these restaurateurs in New York City and they're really great and they're going to go out of business if people aren't working at the co-location, et cetera, et cetera. But Bruce says, the economics of workplace do touch everyone and everything, like commercial business district located restaurants and service businesses that once successfully catered to workforce professionals. It was a, basic model. Some adapted, like my friend in Chicago, Bill Jacobs, whose pizzeria now during the day caters to delivery. Wherever people are working, we'll send you pizza and beer. And the businesses that don't pivot, they perish. I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great point. So first thing on the Jamie Dimon comment, I mean, that just seems ridiculous from the CEO of a capitalist bank. So it'd be like saying, you know what, we don't want to put the cart and horse makers out of business, so let's stop people driving cars. You can't hold up progress to, prevent, the slow decline of some historic industry. So yes, it is the case. So to set the playing field, the US economy on average is doing really pretty well. Mm-hmm. Europe kind of reasonably well, but growth is still positive. It's not that spending's collapsed, it's that it's moved from city centers to the suburbs. I actually spoke to the board of Panera Bread a while ago, and they said, look, what we've seen is city centers are soft, suburbs are doing really well. So these dollars spent are there, they're just in a different location. Now, how does this shake out? The way it shakes out, actually, I was talking to someone yesterday that owned a chain of restaurants in downtown San Francisco. The way it shakes out is rents drop until those restaurants become more become profitable again. He said rents were down 70%. So the people that have lost money is people that own retail, real estate in city centers. They just need to cut their rents until folks can make money in those locations again. Because if you own a restaurant in downtown New York and you can't make money, the odds are no one else can make money either. So if you leave it, you need to basically, these owners need to go back to their landlords and renegotiate the leases to a rate that allows them to be profitable again. So it is an issue. It's affected everything. I mean, the reverse, by the way, there are businesses out in the suburbs doing incredibly well. There was a piece in the Wall Street Journal, I think yesterday, actually, pointing out how suburban shopping malls are having a bonanza. Things like golf courses, ski resorts. So it's not that the economy is doing badly. It's just pivoted, and there are winners and losers. And I don't think we should hold up change in order to protect losers. We should be aware of them. And in some cases, put in support mechanisms. But I don't think we want to block change to protect some groups that lose. The groups that have lost from work from home are pretty limited, by the way. So I'm happy to come back to it. But there's a lot of people have won a lot, and a few people have lost. And the winners are very big in relation to the losers.
Yeah, the winners, like my friend in Chicago, who not only did he pivot to delivery, he's been able to retain nearly his entire staff. That's unheard of in the restaurant business post-pandemic. And yet he's been able to do it. I've got one more comment I want to get to, and then I want to get to Mark. Lauren writes, Lauren Pasquarella, the friend and past guest on the live show, and she says there seems to be some return to office contagion for companies and leaders right now. Based on the headlines and what their peers are doing, how can we better respond to and advise companies and leaders who see other senior execs and CEOs doubling down on RTO, despite the positive remote hybrid work data that you talk about, Nick?
I mean, it's fantastic. Thanks very much for the great question from Lauren. We're also very, good LinkedIn friends. So, I mean, for me, the main thing, as going back over the years, I used to work in McKinsey, 20 years ago, is try and nudge CEOs and execs to data and away from anecdote. I'm aware it's hard. When I teach my MBAs or exec heads, I'm aware that anecdote sells. Ideally, I kind of do data and anecdote. So I say, here's the data and here's an anecdote to explain it to, because I get that humans don't naturally want to always look at charts and figures and facts. But if you actually look at the data, it shows you that work from home is, flat and is stable. So I'm aware that they're reading about Elon Musk and whatever in the newspaper. It's worth just coming up with some examples of other firms. Like I noticed Dropbox, Facebook, some of these companies are actually getting rid of space. It's not that they're saying everyone can work from home forever. They're typically going to hybrid. And just to explain why, the reason that hybrid has become so popular in particular is studies show it's about flattened productivity. So you may say, like, how, I often execs say, how can that be? People are at home on Monday and Fridays. There's less time connecting, less mentoring. I'm like, yes, that's maybe correct, but they tend to be more focused on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, say they're in the office. But the big upside for having people work from home on Friday is, one is you save about 70 minutes of commute. And that's a lot of time, and people spend some of that working. And two is it's quieter. And a lot of the evidence suggests you're more creative if you have some quiet time and some loud time. And so hybrid looks like, on average, from many studies, about flattened productivity. This is not better or worse. But then you have this huge gain that employees really like it. And the studies show it's worth about an 8% pay increase. Or in one of the randomized control trials I did, introducing hybrid reduced quit rates by 33%. And so for the typical firm, a free 8% pay increase from a perk that costs you nothing is a clear win. Basically, you don't have to pay your employees, in a sense, 8% extra to stop them leaving your firm and going to your rival. When I talk to companies, I'm like, if you cancel hybrid and force people back 5 days a week, you should think in your head, you want to be paying your employees about 8% more. Baseline pay increase is maybe 6% right now. Inflation's about 3%, maybe 2-3 extra for real. So you're looking at 5-6% pay increase, typical. And then imagine adding an extra 8%. I mean, who wants to, put up salaries by 12-13%? It's just going to bankrupt you. And so the simple economics of it, the capitalism of it says we can't afford that. Why would you do that for nothing? And so firms are saying, fine, we're going to stick with hybrid.
Mark?
Nick, a quick anecdote and then a question. The quick anecdote, I was at the Coronet conference on Monday in Denver, and I think a mutual connection for probably all four of us on the call, Phil Kirshner of McKinsey, was on stage presenting the results of a study of GitLab and the application of the McKinsey Organizational Health Index. And GitLab, which has no offices and never has as a fully distributed company, has scored in the top decile in terms of McKinsey's 25-year study. But the anecdote is Phil was asked the very same question that Jan posed. You know, what's the response to the CEOs that are sort of perhaps feeling this contagion? And Phil very bluntly said, hey, in reality, and this is sort of counter to the headlines of the algorithms, in reality, the CEOs that are mandating people back to the company are CEOs of real estate companies, or companies that have large real estate holdings, right? So he sort of flatly rejected that in reality that contagion is spreading. So there's the anecdote. Nick, question for you, and sort of back to maybe a little bit of wonky economics. Forgive me. If it's true, as Dan sort of shared in his anecdote about his friend that runs the pizza company that's finding that it's shifting its distribution of services to people in the suburbs, it's becoming a delivery company more so than a destination. And if it's true as well that we see some redistribution of population into the suburbs, and if it's true that there still is some value to human gathering, that work from home's great when I want to concentrate, but sometimes I yearn to be sitting across the table from Nick to be able to grab a pen on the whiteboard. What does that suggest is going to be needed in terms of the production and distribution of office? If all the offices were in the CBD and the people are elsewhere, is this a creative destruction moment for the office industry? Is co-working on the rise, as people want to believe? What do you think we ought to anticipate in terms of the macroeconomics of office as an industry?
It's a great question. So I'll first talk about what firms I think are going to do, and then how that translates to office space. So about 60% of people come into workplace every day. So they think of food service, teaching, security, healthcare, etc. So of the other 40%, about 3/4 of them are hybrid, and the rest are fully remote. If you look at hybrid folks, typically they're going to settle out or coming into the office 2-3 days a week. Fully remote for grads, people listening, they typically have off sites. So it's not like they never meet, as you say. They maybe meet up, once every 4 or 5 weeks. So given that, what are we going to see in future? We have some people that want to be there all the time, so they're going to have offices. They're mainly not offices people that are coming in 5 days a week. They actually mainly work in factories, retail outlets, hospitals, schools, etc. So those buildings are pretty much unchanged. The offices is really where the action is. And there'll be a mix. There'll be some, big, shiny Class A offices in central business districts that folks come in for 3 days a week. So if I was having folks coming in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it may just about make sense to have the office. It was, always half empty before the pandemic anyway, because no one came in nights and weekends. It's now just a little less economical. Once you start to drop to 2 days a week, or certainly 1, and particularly if you're fully remote, you want to move to a different model. You probably want to be renting the space as you need it. And so I think there's going to be a bunch of big offices in city centers that are there permanently by, Goliath National Bank, from How I Met Your Mother, fictional company or whatever you like, is going to have its big office. That's not going to change. And then there'll be a bunch of folks, like Liquid Space or Gable or Radius, some of these companies that are going to be renting space on the day by day, in the city centers, out in the suburbs. And that makes an enormous amount of sense. Look, if I only need an office 1 day a week, 2 days a week even, why do I need to pay for it full time? I don't. Well, another company I'm working with, Tandem, is trying to office share. So I think these flexible solutions are going to do extremely well going forwards. And we're going to see, a range of choices. Some companies are going to have their own. A lot, there's a company, I won't mention who they were. They're a famous company. I just don't want to, break privacy. They said, look, we have offices across the US. A couple of places we kept our headquarters. One was in SF, and the CEO said, we're going in there 3-4 days a week. It makes sense to have that. Also, when we have retreats, we do it there. Yeah. They said in Denver and Austin, the occupancy is so low, we've just decided to cancel the office lease. We're giving it back, and we're now using, a Liquid Space Gable type aggregator now just to book space as we need. And they said it's much more flexible, and we're saving an enormous amount of money. The employees quite enjoy it. They were saying, you get to sample different locations. So I think that's very much the future.
We're going to get to Fran in a second, Nick, but I want to get to our friend Denise Bruder, who I know you know very well from Sway. She says, Nick, behavioral economics tell us that people will naturally make decisions that reflect their own quote unquote self-interest. Do you think that's influencing senior leaders who don't believe that people can be accountable for their performance in remote work? And I think it ties into what you just said about like the options that Mark provides in liquid space. What are your thoughts?
So great. Hey, great to catch up, Denise, as well on this. I'll give you an anecdote, actually, a story. Rather than do data, I'm just going to reverse it around, which is I interviewed Marissa Mayer of Yahoo fame. So Marissa, you know, she was CEO of Yahoo of 2012 to 2017. I think she's, you know, had multiple famous startups since then. And it was fascinating talking to her about what happened in 2013. So if people remember back, there was this huge kerfuffle in the press about apparently Yahoo canceled work from home. And she, I think, very unfairly got a lot of criticism. And I asked her what happened. And she was literally a decade ahead of her time. So she said, look, when folks are in the office, you can kind of see what they're doing. Are they like at the computer typing away? When you walk by, can you see their screen is Excel or whatever, you know, some coding language? Or is it Netflix or Champions League? It's not the best management practices. It's maybe a 5 out of 10, but it's definitely livable. If, on the other hand, they're working from home, you can't see them. You know, they disappear. There's no way to see what they're up to.
Exactly.
And if you rely on input management, you know, desk watching, it's a disaster. Of course, you can go to that nasty surveillance software, which is horrible and nobody likes it. So he said, look, you've really got to focus on output. You've really got to think of, you know, performance reviews. And this came up because she said the fully remote team she had when she took over, she discovered there's really no output metrics. So no one had any idea what was going on. And she said, look, what we did is we called them back into the office. We evaluated them. We set up a bunch of metrics and achievables and performance reviews. And then after we got, you know, a year of benchmark data, we said, fine, you guys can go work hybrid. So she had hybrid 10 years ago. So my advice for leaders is the one thing, you know, desk watching was never great in the office. It was livable. It was kind of a set, you know, a sticking plaster type approach. It's a complete fiasco if people are remote, even if you're 1 day a week. And so it pushes a lot to just better performance management systems, performance reviews, evaluating people on output 360s. When I was at McKinsey, that you know, they were very good at that. They had these grids of various things they evaluate. They looked at the data. I felt incentivized and motivated, I can assure you. I mean, it's, you know, it was pretty stressful, to be honest. It's one of the reasons I eventually moved on from McKinsey. But it didn't really matter whether I was at home or in the office. It didn't matter that my manager, whether she was watching me or not. I was still working hard. And that's really, on Denise's point, what managers need. It turns out performance evaluation is important in the office. It's completely critical when you work from home. You can't really do without it.
Fran?
Nick, talking about the current discussion on LinkedIn, which is pretty activated with respect to flex space versus traditional space. There seems to be this lack of understanding across the range of participants. Some who know real estate very well and built and owned and leased, whatever. And the other side are workplace people who really say, well, we really need this truly flexible workplace and all the bells and whistles that we want. But there doesn't seem to be any coming together of an understanding of how the economics of real estate work. And there is a disconnect there that I think is unfortunate. And I think what we need is a little more understanding across the line there between what makes flex work and what makes real estate work. And how do we deal with that in the current environment where we know the financial markets are drying up for real estate, anything? How are we going to deal with that over the next several years when there's going to be no money for new real estate? We're not going to be able to build much, and nobody wants to pay for TIs. How do we deal with growing a more flexible space in that environment?
The great question. I think there are two things here. One is the change has just been enormous. So if you look back, whenever you have these massive changes, it just takes a while to settle down. And most of the changes to hit our society, things like the computer, the internet, you know, even going back in time, the electric engine, the steam engine, they took decades to work through. This whole amazing economics. Robert Solow, who won the Nobel Prize, said this famous quip in the New York Times in 1996, which I know is a long time ago. You said, you see computers everywhere, except in the productivity statistics. So he was pointing out, it seems like we see them, but they don't show up. And it took a decade or so for this to happen. we've had something forced upon us more or less overnight. So February 2020, nobody, the numbers in the US were 7% of days will work from home in Feb 2020. They're up to about 65% in April 2020. I mean, a 10x increase. So partly I think it will take time. The other thing that's really interesting is talking to a lot of execs. They say it used to be that real estate folks within companies sat underneath the CFO. So it's very much like a lease and financing, very financial decisions that financially astute people needed to know. Now they say some of them are still connected to CFO, but they're moving often to underneath the CHR as well, because it turns out that real estate decisions are much more integrating with HR. Like if you're going to decide hybrid, it clearly a big decision is how you do it. Do you have the same 3 days, which means you can't cut space, or does team A do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, B Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, etc. And these are trade-offs that the same person needs to see. So I think that's another critical thing. It's like the reorganization of companies. And I don't know if anyone else has an experience, but a few companies said they've moved the head of real estate to now jointly report to the CHR as well as the CFO to try and address the type of issues you raised.
One of the great things about this show, Nick, is that I get live real-time questions from our viewers who are great. And Jerome asks, how influential are HR leaders in the C-suite? Even if a chief HR person is there, does this person rank behind the operator, the financial guy, or the marketing head? What are your thoughts?
Another fantastic question. So, hey, Jerome, again, this is, by the way, LinkedIn has become where it's at. I used to be big on Twitter, and Twitter's kind of like dived. And LinkedIn has really taken off. I mean, Twitter's, so yeah, I love the fact everyone's connected up. CHRs has been maybe one of the, or CPOs, Chief People Officer, Chief Human Resource, their various names. That's been one of the biggest gainers in a sense of the pandemic. So I know less about pre-pandemic. I had less boardroom exposure, but certainly I've noticed, and I've said this many times, that CHRs now are really critical in a bunch of companies. There's obviously a CEO, then the CFO typically is number 2. And then if you're a tech firm, it could be CTO, maybe, it depends. But CHRs has risen up many ranks. I would say they're typically above CMOs now in the importance of things, because they are critical for deciding hybrid, fully remote, different structures. This performance review stuff I talked about, that then feeds into real estate. It also feeds into strategy. So just to give you 2 examples, if you're Airbnb, you've gone for fully remote. Turns out fully remote is much more appealing to people in their 30s and 40s. Why? Because they're kind of on the flatter bit of the mentoring curve. So if you want people to be fully remote, you're looking at slightly more seasoned, older employees, not massive, 30 is still pretty young. If on the other hand, say you're Apple and you're having people in 3 days a week, you can hire straight out of college. I have a number of undergrads that will go work for a 3-day-a-week company. Mostly they would not want to work in a fully remote company. So your strategy on HR affects your hiring, which affects affects everything. So CHRs have clearly risen up the ranking, and their thoughts and their decisions affects many more parts of the firm than I guess it did beforehand. It was important, but it's a little bit behind the scenes. Now it's front and center with real estate, which affects finance, with strategy, which affects products and innovation, product line, location, et cetera, et cetera.
You bring up a really interesting point, because I think about the old model of the HR head was a crisis mitigator. They're dealing with the creeps in the office who are hitting on the younger, employees and having to deal with all the legal and the legal aspects of that. But now, as you say, you've got a 5-generational workplace where perhaps the younger people, like my daughter, who is just entering it, value maybe being in the co-location, or maybe being in a place where they're close in real life to people who can mentor them. And certainly the case of people who are on the older edge of that 5-generation workplace that like that experience of being in the office. And perhaps, as you said, in between, on the bottom of that bell curve, are people that are more comfortable with being remote. So maybe this is going to be a renaissance period for the CHR.
Totally. I think it's permanent, by the way. I think it's a permanent shift. The other thing, issue on the young folks that comes up a lot from talking, particularly professional service companies, is yes, people in their 20s typically want to be in 3-4 days a week to get mentoring, but they need to be mentored by somebody. So there has to be somebody doing the mentoring. And that person also needs to come in, and that person is typically in their 30s and 40s. So I hear so many times of like, law, this is the classic in law firms. They say, oh yeah, all the associates want to come in 4 days a week. They want to work from home on Friday. They want to train, and they're hungry, and their home apartments, they're sharing with 4 other people. So it's not even that amenable to work from home. But the senior partners, they have a nice house, and they want to be at home, 4 or 5 days a week. But who's going to do the training? And so like we have to, the head of HR saying like, we've got to force these senior partners in 2 days a week because it's part of their job. But it's not just making money from clients. Part of their job is also teaching the next generation. And that becomes an HR issue that has to feed into the CEO.
Nick, at the Cornet conference this past week, and I fell into a conversation over dinner with 3 workplace strategists, and we landed on this very topic. And with regards to sort of the shifting role or responsibility of the HR leaders, they had the following prediction. They said, observation, I should say. It said the HR leader, the CHRO, was historically predominantly focused on recruiting, onboarding, and compliance. And the corporate real estate leader was responsible for massive capital expenditure projects, shovels in the ground. And the prediction from these 3 folks that I admire was, it's really got to be a bit of both of those things. And their prediction was perhaps there's going to be a chief experience officer role, whether literally or in principle, because the ongoing experience of the employees, where they work, are they getting access to the right nurturing, the right mentorship, the right environments, without reverting back to a mandated place? That's a whole new tradecraft, they suggested. Reaction on that, Nick? Will there be chief experience officers?
I mean, you're right. New roles do come up. There's some econ literature, interestingly, on the COO, the chief operating officer, tends to have dropped out. And the CTO has risen up a lot, chief technology officer. So there are now probably more CTOs on boards than there are COOs. COOs goes back to the era more of manufacturing, and CTOs is more tech and finance. So you're completely right. I wouldn't be surprised if what's the without getting too much into the weeds, that people are calling this chief people officer rather than the chief of human resources, and it's seen as a wider role. Right. But you're totally right. Real estate and HR used to be different worlds, and now they're incredibly overlapping. Come back to Fran's point, it's very hard to make a real estate decision and vice versa if you don't understand. And it's, I'm not sure anyone but has all that information in their head, but you need experts reporting into you because they're co-determined now. And in fact, it links to strategy. Coming back to earlier, Airbnb's decision to be fully remote is going to affect its hiring, its effect, its innovation, its product connection, a bunch of stuff, because it affects the demographics of the firm. If you want to hire really young people, you're looking at different markets and different things versus folks in their 30s and 40s. Like GitHub, I'm guessing, tends to have a somewhat older, more experienced workforce than, say, a fully in-person investment. Well, some of the front rank investment banks are very, very steep pyramids with vast numbers of 20-somethings doing all the work and very thin partner structures. That was certainly my experience of McKinsey. McKinsey was actually a pretty young company because it's fast up or out.
Fran?
Nick, do you tell me your feelings about private sector unionization? Unions we always thought about for manufacturing and transportation and the big organizations. Whereas in the knowledge worker segment, the only ones that are unionized are government workers. All the government workers, knowledge workers, are unionized. Others are not. Most private sector is non-union. But we see this pushback coming, and it's been fairly vocal and meaningful when you look at Amazon, for example, the big walkout they had there. New York Times walked out Monday afternoon, half a day out. I think we're seeing more agitation on the side of workers who don't want to enter into these RTO situations, RTP as I call them, return to the past, which are not favorable to them, and they don't like them. Okay. And now there's this threat of being fired because you're not making enough presence in the office. When that starts to happen, if it does, you think that might be a trigger for increased unionization in the private sector among major firms?
I mean, it's a really interesting question. So just to set the scene, unionization in North America in the private sector is incredibly low. I think something like 5%. I mean, basically almost nobody is covered by a union. I don't know if any of you guys are. I'm not, as far as I'm aware, covered by a union in the private sector.
I have a union boss in my wife, but other than that.
Yeah, in the public sector, I mean, so the history of union, go back to the Tolpodal martyrs, is basically fighting off, voracious bosses. And that's normally you think of as a private sector thing. I always think as an economist, public sector unions are a bit odd because they're representing public sector workers against the government, which is really all of us.
Yeah.
And so I've never been a huge fan of public sector unions. I've generally seen more problems than benefits, because if you look at, the US school system, there's some real issues with public sector unions blocking change. Having said that, so I'm going to park that. I'm really going to talk about private sector unions. On private sector unions, you're right. Some of them are pushing back against RTO. I mean, it's a major perk. When you talk to recruiters, it used to be pensions and healthcare were the big two.
Mhm.
And now work from home is number 3. So now there's a third perk. And I'm not surprised that when unions negotiate, or if you want collective bargaining, you maybe say, look, we care about pay, obviously, but we also care about these 3 big perks. You're right. It's kind of interesting in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, some of the biggest fights in Germany have been between public sector unions and the government. By the way, it's less obvious to me in the public sectors and the government. Very generous work from home makes sense, because coming back to the discussion earlier, one of the issues with work from home is you want to be able to have good performance evaluation systems. In the public sector, that's often hard to do. I actually worked in the UK Treasury, the finance ministry, for about a year, and it's hard to assess civil servants' performance. So I'm not saying these folks should be in the office 5 days a week, but I would be nervous about public sector workers working from home, say 4 days a week, unless they have a good performance evaluation. If they're doing something, they're in some government call center where you can evaluate every call and the quality, sure, it's easy to do that remotely. If it's very intangible, sensitive public sector work where it's hard to evaluate output, I maybe would feel happier with them in 3 days a week. I'm not saying they should come back full time, but I can get some, I can kind of see the balance on this.
Okay.
Mark?
Just a quick comment on our government here in the States. I had a wonderful chat with Chuck Hardy over the weekend, also at Cornet. Chuck's the chief architect of the GSA. And what's the GSA doing now with the world's largest office portfolio, 375 million square feet of leased space? They're building out internal co-working spaces for federal employees, right? So whether it was lobbied for by the public employee unions or whether it was smart leadership on the part of Chuck and the GSA, they're introducing flexibility and choice to the federal workforce, which I think is hopeful. Back to you, Dan.
On that point, because I live in the DC area, and a couple of points, there's so many things I want to talk about. I'm a former headhunter, so all the things that Nick talked about how, money was usually first, but you never heard about flexibility from work. Now it is front and center. And one of our questioners, Michael Scherer had brought up the idea of housing costs. I mean, with interest rates, fixed loans now at north of 8%, which I think my home mortgage refi in 1990 was 8%. So for people working from home or working remotely, how does that cost structure that they can't pass on to anybody impact the research findings that you're seeing, Nick?
So I actually think work from home could end up being a huge solution to rising cost of housing. So first is the cost of living is definitely in housing has clearly gone up. Mm-hmm. So there's 2 factors. One is the cost of housing is up. We know that there's been a housing price boom. And secondly, you multiply that by rising interest rates, and now your monthly payments up a lot. So I completely understand that. The reason work from home can be a good solution is it enables people to move out. So talking to some property developers, they said, look, pre-pandemic, land 1 to 2 hours out from the city center is not really that usable. It's how, people can't commute. They're not going to commute in and out an hour each way most days. Some will, but it's a pretty arduous commute. Mm-hmm. They said, now, look, if people are working hybrid, you're only going into the office 2 days a week. That suddenly becomes okay. And so suddenly you have these huge rings of land around big American cities that are pretty empty user. In California and San Francisco, this East Bay and over into Central Valley. If folks are prepared to put up with commuting for 1.5 hours each way, but only for 2 days a week, suddenly you can access what's currently farmland in a lot of places and build low-cost housing. Now, that hasn't quite happened yet because the pandemic's recent, and it's, no, if you're a property developer, you've got to be certain this is going to stick, then buy the land, then build the housing. But if you look kind of 5 years out, I think we're going to see a boom in housing on the very far fringes of cities, producing a lot lower cost family housing. Interesting, if you look in city centers, which typically were very expensive, those rents and prices have actually come down. I was showing data yesterday. If you look at the Zillow data, city center prices in the largest 12 US cities are down 5% in dollar terms versus Feb 2020. This is to pay for an apartment. Inflation is up 70% over that period. So in real terms, they're down about 20%. So city center properties have actually come down in real terms quite a bit. It's the suburbs that are up, but that's where supply is going to rise. So in the long run, things look positive, but right now it's pretty crushing.
But Nick, wouldn't you say that as those large blocks away from the CBDs grow, that ultimately tenants are going to be out of these big downtown buildings? Those leases are going to be up. They can relocate. They can distribute it. They can do much more distributed office support in those regions than one at big MSA. Wouldn't that be a logical conclusion?
Yeah, so, you know, the interesting, yes, to some extent, and certainly for smaller and medium-sized firms, you may just move out. So if I'm a firm of 10, 20, 30 employees, I may move out. What's interesting to me is early on in the pandemic, and Fran, you must have seen this in, you know, March, April, May 2020, there's a lot of discussion of hub and spoke. So big companies were saying we're going to have a central office and, you know, hub in the center and spokes. That never really came to pass. And I think the reason is, under hybrid, people on their days they come in, let's say they're 2 or 3 days a week, they want to connect with other people. So what seems to be for bigger companies, you just have one big office in the city center. People live all over the city. The problem is putting it in one suburb is folks in the opposite suburb now have like a 2-3 hour commute. So you have one big office in the center. Everyone comes in for just 2 days. But you're right, for smaller startups, smaller companies, I may, you know, establish myself from the get-go in South Bay. And then, you know, the south of that is very rural. So yes, in the long run, this stuff is more flexible. And so I think the long run, if I was a small startup company now, I probably wouldn't start in central San Francisco and New York. I'd be out in the suburbs.
You would have no office, I'm sure.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. As you could ask Mark on Liquid Space, but I'm involved in a bunch of startups and as advisor, and mostly they're either fully remote or very generously hybrid. In part because startups tend to be really motivated.
Right.
So if you only have 5 to 6 or 10 people, they have a lot of folks with equity, high incentives. They're crazy hard working. It's harder when you have 2,000 people and then you have to have management systems and control process, because otherwise you have the people who quit and have multiple jobs, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Gentlemen, and Nick in particular, this has been absolutely fascinating. We have run out of time. We actually had a lot of viewer questions we didn't get to ask, and perhaps we can get to it offline. Those questions will be available in the LinkedIn thread for this show today. I have one final question for you, and it is, what's your work fit, Nick Bloom? What attribute, condition, experience, place, or state of mind makes the work you do a wonderful part of your day, doing other wonderful things, and this is the best part, and not the all-consuming time suck of a day? What's your work fit? I have a very unusual thing. I'm weirdly hybrid. If I turn around, you know, I'm on a camera out the window. That is Stanford campus. Beautiful. So my commute to work is by bike, and it's what, you know, 5, 6, 7 minutes. So I do hybrid within the day. So what happens, being on the West Coast, in the mornings are frantic because, you know, the East Coast in Europe's awake. And so I basically have back-to-back, you know, Zoom or Teams calls until about lunch. Then normally go and see students, meet colleagues until about 3. And then often I'll take my youngest, or, you know, we have a kind of a childcare rota, one of my younger 2 kids, to soccer. I just, you know, work next to the field. It just turns out to be easier. So I'm sat in my car. So if anyone gets an email from me between 4 and 5:30 West California time, I'm probably sat in a car next to a training pitch. But I am hybrid day by day. But I get, if you have a half an hour commute, that makes no sense. But if you live next to the work, it actually, on the West Coast, you know, I never get out of the house before about 11:30 because it's continuous Zoom calls. You are absolutely prolific on LinkedIn. If somebody's watching today and they want to learn more about you or connect up with you, how would they do that?
Yeah, just connect up or follow on LinkedIn. Yeah, it's become so dominant. Actually, I used to, Elon Musk, his takeover of Twitter just seems to have doomed the platform. It used to be before then. LinkedIn's done the right things and Twitter seems to have just gone in the wrong direction. I mean, they're like past each other. You know, It used to be Twitter, now it's LinkedIn. So I try to post. I've stopped actually posting some stuff on Twitter because the anonymity means you get really snarky, nasty comments. And you're not engaging with people. Who knows who's behind that? And it's often, somebody with some vested business interest. The nice thing about LinkedIn is it's a public and you see who's there and you have a reputation. And, because of that, I also try and put time and effort and thought into responding. I don't just spout stuff out that you may do on Twitter if you can be anonymous.
Professor Nick Bloom from Stanford, this has been brilliant. This has been wonderful. And thank you, Fran and Mark, for helping me host this event today. We've learned a lot. Nick, I hope we can get you on at some future point. This story is not done being written, right?
No, I should end to say, the other day, I was amazed at how there's still so much media on it. So with one of my grad students, we were looking at there's about 2,000 daily US newspapers, an amazing number, lots of local papers, and we scraped them for the share of words like work from home, remote work, hybrid, etc. What you see is it went up about 100-fold in March 2020. So, the media is full of discussions. It dropped back down, but it's now stabilized at about 5 times the level pre-pandemic. But that's about the level we're working from home. So I think this is the new normal. I was like, wait a minute, the media is still intense. But I think the reason it's intense is just 5 times as many days are spent at home. So people are just 5 times as interested. So there's 5 times as many newspaper articles. So this is where it's at. I don't think it's ending. It's not like people can get bored. I mean, we're all spending our time doing it. 40% of North Americans are working from home in any given week. And so, of course, they love stories and research and stuff on it. So
there it is. There's your answer at the end of the question. It's 5X. It's 5X.
That's right. It's on the chart, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Fran. Yeah, exactly.
Gentlemen, stick around for the cocktail party. We're going to end the show. Let everybody go to their bathroom break in their next scheduled activity. Thank you so much. It's been a brilliant show. Take care.
Thanks very much, guys.
Bye, guys.